Welcome back to Obsession Engineering for the next bit of the ZX10 project. Today the plan is to do a valve clearance service, oil and filter change, and I can put my newly repaired radiator back on. So that I can get in to do the valve clearances, which are under this cover, I'm going to take the throttle bodies off. But before I do that, I'm going to have a little blow round with an airline to make sure there's no debris sitting anywhere that could fall down the inlet ports, because what we don't want is things falling inside the engine. So I'm going to give it a bit of a clean and then take the throttle bodies off. I find it easiest to disconnect the throttle cables at the twist grip, so I take the throttle housing off and then just feed the cables back underneath the headstock. Then there are a selection of electrical connectors and breathers and fuel pipes and bits going to the throttle bodies that you have to faff around with. The clamps that actually hold the throttle bodies on, there are drillings in the frame so you can get an Allen key straight onto them, so at least that bit's fairly straightforward. It is a little bit of a fiddly job, but it does make access to the rocker cover considerably easier. So that's the throttle bodies off, and there's a couple of interesting things to note on ZX10s, and this is similar on some of the ZX6s as well, is the inlet ports are machine finished in the factory, so it's not just a plain casting, it looks like they've been gas flowed, but they're not actually gas flowed, you know, by hand by a specialist, they're just done by machine, but they do look quite nice. And I have seen plenty of them advertised on eBay as hand-ported and polished cylinder head. It's not, it's just like that from the factory. The other thing we have to remember on early ZX10s is these engine mounts here that hold the front of the engine in place are very close to the coils. So number 1 and number 4 coils are an absolute pig to get out. So you actually have to take this engine mount out, and the same on this other side as well. It's a little bit of a faff, and it does mean if you're just wanting to change spark plugs on your bike, it does take about 3 hours. So the next job is to take some engine mounts off. So to take this engine mount off, I decided it was a good idea to have a bolt in this engine mount, so I've put the crash bungs back on. They will not be staying on. I've just had to put them on so that the engine's a bit more sturdy. I have ordered the correct bolts, they're just not here yet. So even with the engine mount off that comes across here, getting this coil out, you can see, still actually touches the main frame, but it does just slide out the hole. The one for number 1 at the other end is actually even tighter. But that's out now, so we can get to spark plugs. Because it's such a, you know, lengthy job to change spark plugs, I thought while we're here we may as well just go one step further and actually take the rocker cover off and check the valve clearances. Because they're done and we can forget about them till the next, you know, 16,000 miles. Now that I've got the coils out, I've just pulled this rubber cover back out of the way so I can get to all the rocker cover bolts. So I'm just going to buzz out the 6 bolts that hold the rocker cover on, and then I can take the rocker cover off and push it forwards. The advantage of doing this job with no radiator in is I can actually just push the rocker cover out of the front, so there's a nice big hole to work in. Normally if the radiator's there, it's a bit of a game twisting it around and trying to prop it around and try and get it out the hole. So today, we've got the easy option. No radiator, loads of room. Now I've got the bolts out, I can just wiggle the rocker cover off. And there we go out the front. According to the workshop manual, and it's the same for workshop manuals for pretty much everything Japanese, you take this cover off, you can turn the crank and you can see the timing marks to line the cams up with certain points. But we're not going to do that, we're going to cheat. If I go around this side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jog by hand the engine into 6th gear, and then if I rock the engine bit by bit, I'll actually be able to rotate the engine from the back wheel, and that will very, very slowly turn the cams so that these lobes, like this one, is sticking upwards, which means the base circle, which is the bit around the back of it, that is against the bucket, and so I can check the clearance. So I've just dogged the engine into 6th gear, and so now, if I just knock the back wheel around by hand, you can see the cams moving round. So for example now, this cam just here, and the lobe that's underneath this plastic cover that's in the way, they now have the lobe pointing upwards, so the base circle is nearest the bucket, and so I'll be able to slide a shim underneath the base circle between sort of this bit of the cam here and the bucket that's down there, and that will give me my valve clearance. On the inlet, the valve clearance is 0.15mm to 0.24. Exhaust is 0.17 to 0.22. So what I have here is my 0.15 feeler gauge, and if I feed that in underneath the cam, and that slides in there relatively easily, I can move it forward and backwards underneath the cam. So I know it's bigger than 0.15. If I try my 0.2, and that doesn't go in at all. So the chances are that tolerance is about 0.17 to 0.18. That sort of middle of the range between 0.15 and 0.2. So I'm happy that that one is in tolerance, and I shall write it down on a little sheet that I have. What I shall then do is go through every single one and make sure they're all in tolerance. If there is any out of tolerance, what I'll have to do is take the cams out and change some shims. But generally, with road bikes nowadays, they don't move very far, so hopefully we won't have to take too much more apart. Might be a little bit easier to see on this cam lobe. There we go, 0.15, quite a nice easy fit. This is 0.2. And you can see I'm putting a bit of tension on that, and that doesn't go in. So I'm happy that that clearance is about 0.18. So that's in tolerance. So that's all the clearances jotted down on here. They're all in tolerance, so that's happy days on that bit. I'm going to pop the rocker cover back on and then change the spark plugs. To get the spark plugs out, it is kind of useful if you have the Kawasaki bendy in half tool, because that fits past the snug bit of the frame there and drops down nice and easily into the hole. And we like things that slip easily into a hole. So put my spanner on it and we'll undo the spark plug. A bit of a wiggle and out the hole she comes. And there we go, one little iridium spark plug. So I've got a full new set. I shall pop them in one by one, and that'll be halfway through the service. In a flurry of spanner, twirling and low camera batteries, I've got all the top endy bits back together near enough. The next thing to do is to fit this nicely cleaned K&N air filter, cleaned with Motul air filter cleaner, and in a second I shall lubricate it using, if I have it the right way around, some Motul air filter oil spray. So that'll help keep all the bugs and unpleasantness outside the engine. So that's all my top end bits all buttoned up so nothing can get into the engine. When I've been putting it all back together, I've just made sure I've torqued up all the engine mounting bolts and everything correctly, because we don't want the engine to try and fall out of it. The next job is to give the front of the engine a bit of a clean. It's not particularly bad at all, but there's just a little bit of dirt here and there. So I'm actually just going to get in there by hand with a bit of sort of rag and give it a bit of a wipe over, and then it's time to put the radiator on. With nothing more than a bit of a spray GTA5 and a wipe over with a rag, the front of the engine actually looks like new. I suspect if this turned up for first service 16.5 years ago in this state, you'd still call it clean. So that's excellent news. I'm very happy about it. The next thing to do is to fit the radiator. Yesterday I had a little trip out to visit my mate Colin, and we welded this lug back onto the radiator. Once I've refitted my little rubber grommet into this end here, fitting the radiator is pretty straightforward. This side just slides onto a little peg in here, which we can't pick up very well because it's quite dark. That just slides onto here, and the equivalent position on the other side has a bolt, so it slides onto the bolt. Then we slide the bottom of the radiator pin onto this bracket, which has got a little bit of flex in it, and before you know it, we can be connecting hoses up. So refitting the radiator is pretty simple. It pops onto a couple of places, one bolt at the top there that holds it nice and secure. The next thing to do is to connect the pipes, so they are just a case of slipping them onto there and doing the clamps up. Again, pretty simple. I also have to remember not to forget to do the fan connection up, otherwise the fan won't work. Race bikes, you tend to not worry about these things so much. So that's my radiator all plumbed up. All the connections are nice and tight. I have connected the fan back up, all the little push connectors are done, the reservoir's on, Yeah, it's looking pretty good. It is also very, very sturdy now, almost as if that's how it was supposed to be out of the factory. The next thing to do, really, is to put some of Motel's finest fluids in it. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time when we'll be changing the fluids in the ZX10 and getting it ready to ride.